The wind screamed down from the north like something alive, something ancient. It wasn't the gentle hush of snowfall, or the dry whistle of wind across stone. It was a voice, ragged, relentless. It tore across the trees and curled through the cracks of the longhouse, as though trying to speak an older language. That night, as snow fell in thick sheets over the fjords, a man came walking in from the white. His name was Edvin, a trader, a quiet man, known for his patience and sense. Not a skald, not a drunk, not a dreamer. He'd been gone for 2 moons, longer than expected, long enough for his wife to light a candle and whisper his name toward the forest, long enough for the village to begin dividing his gear. But he came back, half frozen and walking, one boot replaced with sealskin rope, his shoulders covered in a shredded pelt that looked more scavenged than worn. They pulled him into the longhouse with murmurs of disbelief. The fire hissed as wet fur hit the floor. Someone handed him broth, but he didn't drink. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the flames. The room was quiet. No one pressed him. They could see something had changed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse. "I followed the elk trail," he said, "past the stone river, up into the high woods, beyond the ice caves." He paused, lips dry and cracking. "That's when I saw them." He leaned forward slightly, as if afraid the fire might burn him for speaking. "They weren't like us," he said. "Not raiders, not bandits. They were men, but not men. End of time." A boy by the fire let out a laugh, but it died quickly in his throat. Edvin didn't blink. They moved low, like wolves do when they stalk. Their clothes were thick, fur layered, and stitched with bone thread. No helmets, no iron, just claws and leather. They hunted without sound. I watched them take down a moose, drove it into a snow gully, circled it, moved as one. He glanced up now, meeting the eyes of the chieftain. There were wolves with them, real wolves, 4 or 5, running alongside them, not leashed, not afraid, like part of the pack. One of the older warriors snorted. "You saw a hunting pack and some beasts nearby. Coincidence. Wolves follow blood." But Edvin only shook his head. "No, I watched them eat, together, like kin. They didn't fight over the meat. They took turns." Someone whispered a word, ulffolk, a name from old stories. Wolf, people, a half-myth, whispered by mothers to scare boys from wandering too far into the dark woods. Edvin didn't laugh. "One of them saw me. A woman. She had a red handprint smeared across her face. The wolf next to her stood up, tall as her ribs. She didn't shout, didn't raise a bow, just stared at me through the trees." He looked down now, voice dropping to a whisper, and then they vanished. I stepped forward to follow, but the trail was gone. The snow was perfect, untouched. No tracks, no breath. No one in the room spoke for a long time. Then a woman crossed herself. A child started to cry. Someone else stoked the fire just for the noise. No one asked Edvin any more questions. The next morning, they found 3 small bones tied with sinew, laid carefully on a flat stone at the village's edge. Edvin had placed them there. A token, a sign, or maybe an offering. No one moved them. No one asked why. Within a week, he was gone again. Took nothing but a knife and a bundle of dried fish. No goodbyes. Just slipped out during a snow squall. He never came back. But the story did. A year later, a scout from the southern ridge claimed he saw strange tracks beside a frozen, stream-long human prints, bare and spaced far apart, flanked on both sides by paw prints moving in unison. The tracks circled a carcass, then vanished. One spring, a boy swore he saw 2 figures at the tree line during twilight, one tall, fur-wrapped, the other 4-legged. He blinked, and they were gone. That same night, the dogs refused to leave their kennels. They growled at the woods for hours. Then someone found the spiral. It was carved into the bark of an old pine, burned deep into the heartwood. Not a random mark, a perfect curve, wrapping inward like a shell or a claw. Old men said it matched the spiral on Edvin's travel pack, the one he left behind. The village called it coincidence, but they stopped sending hunters past that tree. And when the wind howled too sharply at night, when it rose not like wind but like voice, they closed the shutters tighter. In time, Edvin's name faded. Children forgot it. Skalds left his tale out of the winter songs, but the spiral remained. And deep in the woods, when the snow is right and the stars hide, some say you can still hear two things at once: a wolf's howl and the sound of footsteps that don't break the snow. There was a line on every Viking map that wasn't drawn in ink. It was a line understood in story, in silence, in the way eyes shifted when certain directions were mentioned. It marked the boundary between the known world of farms, longhouses, and law in the wild, where names lost meaning and the forest began to think for itself. To the east of the fjords, beyond the last grazing meadows and the charcoal pits, there was a place they called Skogerbak, the back forest. But even that name was only whispered. Most villagers didn't speak of what lay beyond the rivers that never froze, beyond the cliffs where birds vanished mid-flight. Those who did go that far seldom returned, and when they did, they came back changed, quieter, less interested in village life, more drawn to shadows and stars. These were not cowards or outcasts. Some had been warriors, others hunters or weavers. None had been driven away. They left because something called them from beyond the trees. It wasn't madness. It was memory of something older than clans and crowns. What lay beyond the edge was not emptiness. It was an older kind of presence. There were forests there that no axe had ever touched, streams that glowed faintly at dusk, caves that sang when the wind entered them just right. And within those woods, scattered across valleys and ridges, were signs not of civilization, but of habitation. Animal bones stacked in patterns, stones arranged in spirals, charcoal paintings of wolves and men hunting together, their legs blurred, their shapes mirrored. The ones who crossed into that wild did not take shields or iron. They knew better. Iron stank in those woods. It bent the silence. The crows didn't follow those who carried swords, but those who entered bare, cloaked only in fur and ash, were received. It said the forest watched them, measured them, decided if they could stay. Those who stayed long enough began to change, not in body, but in rhythm. They learned to move without snapping twigs, to walk where the wind covered their scent, to fast during full moons, and speak only in gesture when snow fell. They no longer needed fire every night. They no longer feared the dark. Their senses sharpened. They spoke less, listened more. They stopped sleeping through the night, and instead slept in short intervals, as wolves do lightly, alert to sound, movement, breath. Eventually they stopped counting days. And when they returned, if they returned, they spoke differently. Their eyes scanned the tree line even in daylight. They flinched not at blade or beast, but at the echo of laughter. Some didn't speak at all. They sat at the edge of gatherings, watching, as though unlearning the noise of the village. People whispered that their scent had changed, that they smelled of smoke, moss, and something else. Something like frost. Their families welcomed them at first, but fear grew quickly. Children avoided them. Dogs growled without reason. At night, the returned ones would rise silently and stand outside, staring into the forest, listening. Some said they were waiting. Others said they were remembering. No one forced them out, but they were rarely asked to stay. Eventually, they returned to the woods, where their silence made sense. Those forests weren't just home to animals. They were home to memory of a time when humans were not masters, but kin among kin. The people who returned to that way of living didn't disappear. They faded intentionally. They sought the edge because the center no longer made sense. Clans fought clans over cows and borders, while the trees offered endless space and no judgment. They didn't abandon Viking life. They peeled away its noise, its boasting, its violence. What remained was something quieter and older. The hunt, the watching, the howl that rises not in rage, but in recognition. These were the first of the forgotten. They left nothing written behind, but the land remembers. In places where stone spirals remain under moss, where bones are arranged in the shapes of moons, their story lingers. Villagers still tell stories of them, but always at the edge of conversation. They live beyond the ridge, some say. They eat with wolves, others mutter. The tales vary, but one detail always returns. They went willingly. They didn't flee. They chose the forest over the feast hall. And if you listen at night, when the sky is clear and the fire low, sometimes the howling sounds like voices. Sometimes it sounds like names long unspoken. Not all who vanished into the forest did so in silence. Some spoke before they left. Some even argued, but few were listened to. Among the Norse, life was built on bonds, family, clan, oath. Honor was not just a virtue, it was currency. To be part of a tribe meant to submit to its rhythm, the call to raid, the duty to avenge, the festivals, the sacrifices, the shaping of one's story to fit the larger saga. There was glory in conquest, pride in feasting, comfort in knowing your role. And yet, for some, that rhythm began to feel off. Not wrong, just no longer enough. It wasn't the young who felt it first. It was often the seasoned ones, those who had held swords, buried kin, planted crops, and still found something hollow beneath the hymns. Warriors who survived too many winters, women whose dreams remained too vivid, seers whose visions led not to gold or gods, but to the hush of trees and the eyes of animals. Something within them itched against the grain of society. They did not reject their people. They simply no longer believed that what was celebrated was what mattered. They began to question, not loudly, but with small refusals. One man, once a respected huskarl, refused to take silver for a kill he'd made on a raid. He said he didn't feel the enemy's death had been earned, that it had come too easy, too quick. His own kin turned from him, called him soft. He left 2 days later, leaving behind his shield, sword, and name. Took only a knife, a bowl, and his father's fur cloak. Another woman, trained as a healer, was mocked for talking to animals. Not metaphorically, literally. She left food for ravens, watched elk pass without fear, and whispered her dreams into fox dens. When a child fell ill and she healed him using only warmth, snowmelt, and chant. Some called it seether, others called it luck. The next morning, she was gone. These weren't banishments. No torches chased them into the woods, but neither were they asked to stay. Their disobedience was too quiet to punish, but too deep to ignore. There were others. A boy who refused to train with axe or bow, said he preferred listening. When forced to kill a goat, he wept as he did it and then vanished that night, leaving only a stone carving of a wolf curled beside a child. A woman who would not take a husband, saying the trees had already chosen her. Her family laughed, then grieved. She left during the spring rains and was never seen again. Even elders, yes, even those with age's wisdom, walked into the forest with no intent to return. One chieftain, after years of leading raids and settling blood feuds, placed his armband on the hearth and simply walked out. No one followed. Not out of fear, but understanding. These were not acts of cowardice. They were acts of unbinding. To the Norse mind, strength was motion war, trade, feasting, building. But to those who left, strength became stillness, a new strength, one that did not require dominance or even recognition. They weren't forming a rebellion. There was no manifesto, no creed, only a shared hunger to live closer to the bones of the world, to return to the oldest ways, not those of men, but of wolves, rivers, stars. They stopped calling themselves by their given names. Names were meant for reputation, and reputation required others. In the forest, there were no others, only wind, fur, soil, breath. Those who stayed behind told stories, of course, that those who left had been cursed, that they went mad, that wolves would devour them, and the gods would forget their names. But over time, those stories began to change. They began to include strange dreams, voices in the trees, elk herds moving differently, animals behaving with too much calm, even moments during winter hunts when men felt watched, not hunted, but observed, judged. One child came back from a spring pilgrimage with a spiral claw carved into his walking staff. When asked who gave it to him, he simply said, "The quiet ones." Another elder, during her last rites, whispered to her daughter, "You don't need the gods, you need the trees." It wasn't just departure, it was evolution, a fracture not from violence but from memory. Those who left weren't just rejecting the tribe, they were becoming something else. Or maybe, returning to what came before the tribe was ever born. And while the longhouses stayed warm, and the feasts continued, and the sagas were sung of swords and sea kings out there, beyond the mapped world, in places without smoke or names, a different kind of life took root, one without ownership, one without conquest, one where the wolf was not hunted, but followed. To leave behind the longhouse was one thing. To leave behind the axe was another. For most Vikings, the axe was more than a tool, it was identity. Passed from father to son, hung above the hearth, it was the mark of a free man, a raider, a protector. But the ones who walked into the wild left their iron behind, not out of fear, not even out of shame, but because the forest rejected it. Iron rang too loudly. It turned birds silent, made deer step wide. Wolves avoided its scent. The spiral hunters, as some later called them, learned quickly that steel made you visible in ways you couldn't see, so they abandoned it. They returned to the old ways, the ones used before iron had ever kissed flame. Knives were chipped from flint and antler. Fish were caught with barbed bone hooks strung with sinew and patience. Traps were built from bent branches, animal gut, and clever hands. Arrows were fire-hardened sticks, the tips carved into teeth. They became masters of subtlety. They could survive days on broth made from bark and lichen, or a handful of smoked shrew meat. They foraged mushrooms, nettles, and edible mosses. Nothing was wasted. Bones were ground for glue and dusted into soup for calcium. Skins were softened not with lime, but with fat and smoke. And they did not kill when they didn't have to. Unlike village life where livestock was bred, slaughtered, preserved, the forest demanded reverence. Every kill was a negotiation. Before a snare was set, a whisper was given. Before a pelt was taken, a claw was left behind in the snow. It wasn't religion, it was respect, a way of walking through the world without taking more than was needed. They followed the hunger trail, the invisible map that linked stream to hoofprint, claw to carcass, scent to shelter. They learned to track without rushing, to wait longer than any village hunter would. They knew the rhythm of the elk, the seasons of the salmon, the subtle shift in crow behavior before a snowstorm. And they learned from wolves, not by taming them, not by owning them, but by watching, waiting, mirroring. They noticed how wolves fed their weakest first, how they circled prey without striking, wearing it down over hours, how they never overkilled, how they avoided conflict when possible, but moved without hesitation when it was time. The spiral hunters began to move in the same way, low to the ground, quick but quiet, always facing the wind. They used body language more than words, hand signals, breaths, the nod of a chin. They slept curled together for warmth, like pups, one always awake, the rest light in their dreaming. They stopped marking time in days and began measuring life in hunts. No calendars, no moons, only patterns. And when the hunger came, the real hunger, the sharp kind, the kind that curled your gut and made your vision blur, they did not panic. They endured. They remembered that survival wasn't strength, it was rhythm, one foot after the other, one root at a time, one moment of silence before the next movement. Those who couldn't endure the hunger turned back, or they died. But those who could changed. Their eyes grew sharper, their steps lighter. They began to smell weather before it arrived. They could hear the wing beat of a raven from miles off. And slowly, over weeks or seasons, they were accepted by the wild. Or perhaps they stopped resisting it. They built shelters not of wood and nails, but of stone and snow, half buried into the earth, warm and hidden. They lined them with furs, covered the entrances with woven branches. No smoke rose from them. No scent gave them away. Even bears passed without noticing. One old tale speaks of a group of reindeer herders who vanished during a blizzard and stumbled into a hidden valley. There, they found meat hanging from trees, drying in the wind, but no fire, no tracks, no voices, just meat, left as offering or warning. They took nothing, and they left quickly. The spiral hunters had no need for walls. They became seasonal, migratory, following the rhythms of wolves, shadowing their roots not out of fear, but strategy. Where wolves fed, they knew the land was strong. Where wolves disappeared, something was wrong. In summer, they moved light, carrying only what could be bundled into bone-framed packs. In winter, they hunkered down, disappearing beneath the snow like sleeping spirits. They had no villages, no kings, no silver, but they were never cold, never starving, and never truly alone. One chieftain, late in life, is said to have sent his youngest son north, not in exile, but in hope. The boy was too gentle for war, too silent for court. When he returned 4 years later, he brought no gold, no scars, only stories, and a pelt of a wolf that had died of age, not violence. He gave it to his father and said, "They don't fight for glory, they hunt for balance." Some say that son returned to the forest the next day. Others say he stayed, changed the laws of his village, outlawed wasteful killing, and introduced quiet fasting on new moons. But he never again touched iron. The hunger trail had shaped him, and it would shape others. It did not begin with a howl. The first true moment when man and wolf crossed the line between predator and prey was silent. It happened somewhere in the twilight between seasons, in a forest too old to name, when the snow was thin and the earth still breathed steam from its thawing skin. A man knelt beside a half-eaten elk carcass. He was alone, fur-wrapped, bones tied around his wrist, unarmed. His breath came slow. He was hungry, but he did not move. The elk's ribs had been cracked open by something with powerful jaws. Blood steamed in the cold. The kill was fresh. Across from him, just past the hollow log, stood a wolf. It was not snarling, not circling. It stood still, its flanks rising with slow breath, eyes amber, watching. The man did not meet its gaze directly. He dropped his hand to the snow and tapped it 3 times, a sound too soft to carry, not a command, a rhythm. He backed away. The wolf didn't follow, but it didn't run either. That night, the man left a marrow bone in the snow where he had been kneeling. By morning it was gone. No tracks. The forest had accepted the offering. This was not taming, not domestication. The wolf was no dog, and the hunter was no master. What passed between them was older a kind of truce that came from mutual hunger and a refusal to waste breath. Over time, more such moments happened. A group of hunters found themselves trailing an elk herd, only to find a wolf pack already in pursuit. Instead of chasing the herd off, they slowed their pace, fell back, and watched. When the wolves made the kill, the hunters moved in from the downwind side low, slow, heads lowered. They waited until the wolves had eaten. Then, only then, they stepped forward. No weapons, no shouting. The wolves did not flee. They did not fight. They watched. They accepted. From that moment forward, the hunters began to follow the wolves more often than the prey. This wasn't strategy. It was invitation. Wolves taught them patterns no map could capture. They taught them which winds to avoid, how to circle without being seen, when to break formation, when to scatter. But they taught without teaching. The hunters learned by watching, listening, imitating. They practiced wolf posture, shoulders low, steps silent, eyes always forward. They mimicked the subtle body cues, the raised tail, the tilted head, the growl that never rose above the throat. They stopped talking during hunts entirely. One hunter described the experience as thinking with a different spine, as though his awareness had shifted lower, down into the gut and limbs. Less thought, more response. They called it gray language, the communication that existed without words, a language of breath, balance, and intent, not symbolic, instinctual. The wolves began to tolerate their presence, sometimes even walked near them, side by side, for moments. One hunter was said to have walked a full mile with a black-coated wolf before either acknowledged the other's presence. When they parted, the wolf paused, looked back once, and disappeared. In some circles, the line between hunter and wolf began to blur. Hunters howled not to call, but to answer. They painted their faces with ash and soot to resemble muzzle markings. They wove fur into their cloaks in layered patterns matching the seasonal molt. They fasted on the same days wolves would during lean seasons, refusing to eat until the pack did. They slept beside dens not too close, but close enough for scent to pass. There are stories never sung, only whispered, of a man who laid beside a wounded wolf pup during a storm and woke with the rest of the pack curled around him. When he returned to his people, he spoke only in gesture for a full moon cycle. Not everyone believed. Some mocked, others feared. The idea that wolves and men could share a bond deeper than blade or leash was unsettling, but for those who lived it, it was no longer a belief. It was reality. One earned in silence, tracked in paw prints, sealed with raw breath under starlight. Archaeologists centuries later would find cave etchings showing men and wolves hunting side by side. The depictions lacked the violence typical of Norse art. There were no spears, no blood, only movement parallel and synchronized. In one carving, a man and a wolf stand at opposite ends of a spiral, as if orbiting the same idea. Even today in the far north, herders and rangers tell of strange howl-slow, rhythm-bound, not quite animal, and in some places you'll find bones arranged in circles. Not wolf, not human, both. Whatever happened in those woods, whatever pact was medate, was never written, but it was remembered by the trees, by the ice, and by the wolves. They did not wear armor. They wore winter. At first, the fur cloaks were practical protection against the frostbite that stalked even the careful. Elk hide was too heavy, deer hide too thin, but wolf skindance, warm, silent, moved with the body. It made no sound when brushing past birch trunks. It shed snow. It held heat even when damp. And soon, it became more than clothing. It became a statement. The ones who lived with wolves did not wear steel or bronze. They wrapped themselves in layers of fur stitched with sinew and reinforced with bone. Every strand carried meaning. Each pelt was earned, not bought, taken only from wolves that had died of age, injury, or in defense of the pack. Never for sport, never for show. Wearing wolf fur was not dominance. It was permission granted by death, honored in life. They moved through snow like whispers. Their feet were wrapped in tight bands of hide, the soles padded with wool and bark for silence. The outer layer was fur side down, gripping snow without slipping. Some shaped their toes like paw splitting the sole, allowing better grip in drifts. They no longer left the deep, boot-shaped prints of their village kin. Instead, their tracks blurred at the edges, shallow, disappearing quickly, as though they had never been there. Villagers who glimpsed them called them ghosts. Some called them spirits. But those who had once known Themkin, lovers, called them by a different name, wolf brothers. It wasn't just men. Women walked the same path. Hunters, seers, healers. The forest did not care for gender. It cared only for stillness, for humility, and above all for presence. Their clothes became layered signals, spiral claws etched into the shoulder seams, paw marks sewn into hoods, bone beads that clicked softly when the wind was right. The symbols were not decorative. They were a mnemonic part of a private language shared between members of a tribe without a name. Some coated their cloaks in fine ash, smudging their faces with charcoal to mask scent and reflect moonlight. Their breath rose from beneath low hoods. Their movements became so fluid that watching one walk was like watching fog rearrange itself around obstacles. Wolves began to tolerate them not as pack, not quite, but as familiar shadows. They could approach within a few yards of a feeding site without panic. Some say they slept near dens, under snow shelters built into the hill, their scent blending with the soil. Others say they were seen running, not walking, not stalking, running. A small group, 5 perhaps, spotted at dawn by a Sami herdsman moving silently across a ridge linlow, fast, arms pumping like limbs, not swinging. Their pace matched the wolves beside them. They turned in tandem, stopped together, eyes glowing faintly from snow reflections, then gone. They didn't speak. They didn't write, but their presence altered the land. Hunters from neighboring clans began finding kills left half-eaten, entrails removed and buried respectfully, bones arranged in spiral patterns. Sometimes a claw was left behind, or a piece of carved antler shaped like a tooth. This was their message. We are here. We watch. We do not waste. They hunted without arrows. They used only slings, snares, carved spears. No blood spilled unless necessary. The cleaner the kill, the more respected the hunter. Wounding was seen as failure. Quick death, clean death was the goal. One motion, no cries. Their feet were trained to walk the crest of snowdrifts without collapse. They moved in zigzags and circles to confuse trackers. When crossing frozen rivers, they slid sideways on fur-wrapped soles, arms out for balance, never cracking the surface. They knew every sound snow could make, and how to silence each one. A woman named Sigrunonse, a healer in a coastal village, returned briefly after 7 winters in the woods. She wore a cloak made of interlaced wolf tails, each one tied with a tuft of dyed fur, representing moons past. She stayed for only one night, said nothing, only left herbs, a stone spiral, and a single wolf fang on the village altar. The next morning she was gone, but her trail led nowhere. Children began mimicking her walk. Elders began telling older stories. Even the skalds, who once mocked such people, began to wonder aloud softly, respectfully, if the old gods had merely evolved. Perhaps the wolf was not just a beast. Perhaps it was a bridge between old man and older nature. The wolf brothers did not seek glory. They sought alignment. They walked where the pack walked, ate what the pack ate, slept when the pack slept, and when they died, they did not ask to be buried. They asked to be left under the trees, with their cloaks over their faces and their bones unburned. Their spirals would be carved into bark, and the forest would do the rest. Because for them, the wolf was not an animal. It was a teacher, and they, its students, had become something more than men. They say the first time it happened, it was by accident. A small group of spiral-cloaked hunters had been trailing a herd of elk for 3 days watching, waiting, reading the landscape like a living scroll. The forest was quiet, but not dead. Somewhere nearby, wolves were moving. The hunters could feel it. The air itself seemed taut with intention. Then, without warning, the elk turned, not from the hunters who were downwind and unseen, but from something ahead. In the snow beyond the rise, a second force had emerged, lean shadows, loping low, tongues out, eyes locked. Wolves. And so, between the humans and the wolves, the herd was caught. For a moment there was stillness, then motion. The elk bolted sideways, away from both threats, crashing through a thicket. One stumbled, 2 peeled off. The wolves moved first flanking wide, fast, instinctual. But the humans reacted just behind, rising from their crouch like mist given form. They didn't speak, didn't signal. They ran, together. In parallel lines, 4 humans and 7 wolves swept through the trees like a single, long limb. The spiral hunters didn't chase with weapons raised. They moved as mirrors pushing the elk from one side as the wolves herded from the other. They didn't scream, didn't throw. They shaped the hunt with motion. The elk faltered near a ravine. That was all it took. It was over in seconds. When the dust settled, the humans stood still. The wolves fed first tails stiff, ears high, growling low. The hunters remained at a respectful distance, crouched in silence, eyes down. And when the wolves backed off bellies full, faces red, the humans stepped in. They did not take everything, only what was left, what was offered. Liver, lungs. The heart was untouched. This was not conquest, it was permission. And from that moment, the rules changed. The spiral hunters stopped tracking game alone. They tracked wolves. They followed their routes, learned their rhythms, not to steal kills, but to share them. The humans became scavengers of precision, not of desperation. They waited, offered tribute, learned patience, not as suffering, but as structure. Wolves began to tolerate their presence, then accept it. Some even recognized individuals approaching without aggression, ears twitching forward, tails neutral. It wasn't affection. It was acknowledgement, a recognition of rhythm. These weren't domesticated wolves. These were pack elders, scars on their snouts, teeth yellow with age. They led, and the humans followed not behind, but beside. They learned where to be during the chase, how to read the posture of the lead female, how to see the arc of intention in a loping gait. They became extensions of the hunt. In time, the spiral hunters developed new tools, weighted bolas that spun silently through air, long spears with blunted tips for tripping, not killing. They didn't aim to finish the animal, only to help shape its movement, to create corridors of collapse where wolves could deliver the final strike. They even mimicked wolf calls, not full howls, but sharp barks, yips, and throat clicks. They weren't perfect, but they were understood, used sparingly, deliberately. After each shared hunt, they left offerings, meat folded in bark, tokens carved in bone, paw prints traced in ash. Ritual, perhaps, or memory. Some say the wolves began to return the gesture. Dead prey found laid across human paths. A broken antler, presented like a gift. Even once, a small fox pelt, cleaned and folded, left beside a human shelter. To the outside world, it was madness. To the spiral hunters, it was communion. One story tells of a young hunter who lost his way during a snowstorm. Blinded, starving, he collapsed beneath a spruce. Hours passed. Cold deepened, then warmth, then weight. When he awoke, he was buried in snow and surrounded by wolves. Not attacked, not ignored, sheltered. One rested its flank against his back. He did not move. When the storm passed, they were gone. He lived. He returned, and never spoke again. His clan did not ask why. They already knew. Some archaeologists dismiss these stories as myth, but bones don't lie. In certain caves in northern Scandinavia, remains have been found, wolf and human side by side. No sign of struggle, no ritual burial, just parallel decay, as if they had died together, lying down after a long chase. Scars on the bones show signs of movement-running injuries, not warfare. The joints show shared environments. The tools nearby, sharpened bone, gut cord, claws used as pendants, no swords, no axes, just presence. The spiral hunters didn't invent this bond. They remembered it, from a time before fences and fire pits, from the edge of ice, when warmth meant survival, and survival meant cooperation. The shared kill was never about food, it was about trust. They called it the night without words. It came not with the calendars turning or the village's harvest feasts, but with instinct when the snow crusted just enough to hold weight, when the elk thinned and the wolves howled without hunting. That was when the spiral hunters gathered, not in crowds, not in halls, quietly, deliberately, beneath the oldest trees, far from fire, in clearings where the wind did not speak. They came alone, always alone. Some fasted for 3 days before. Others slept in shallow pits lined with ash. It was not required. There were no rules, only rhythm. The understanding that something had to be shed thought, speech, hunger before it could be replaced. They wore nothing ornate, no carved masks, no painted symbols. Just fur, just bone, faces smeared with charcoal and berries markings that resembled the muzzle of wolves. Not as decoration, but as declaration. That night they did not speak. Not one word. From dusk until dawn, silence held them. The ritual began with breath. Slow, steady, drawn through the nose and out through clenched teeth. A pattern, a drumbeat, without drums. The group would sit or stand in a wide ring, rarely looking at each other, eyes fixed on the trees or sky. Then the sound would begin. A single voice low, sustained more exhale than song. It wasn't a howl, not yet. It was the mimic of one, the shape of it, stretched in the throat, reshaped through repetition. Others joined, not in harmony, but in resonance. Each voice slightly different, each tone a thread in a sound that was not human. It built slowly, layered, rising like smoke. Eventually the sound tipped. It sharpened, stretched higher, and suddenly one would break into a full howl knot, loud, not wild, but long, controlled, raw. It echoed off the trees like something born from bone. This was not performance. No one watched. This was transformation. They did not howl like wolves. They howled with wolves, and sometimes rarely, but enough to be remembered. Wolves answered, not close, never close, but just near enough that the human howls bent in their direction, adjusted pitch, a conversation without language, a negotiation of presence. They didn't believe they became wolves, not literally, but they believed they stepped sideways into something else, something in between. They called it skaldkenna, the knowing of another's rhythm. To howl was not to imitate, it was to align. Some collapsed afterward, others wept. One woman is said to have wandered into the woods, mid-ritual, barefoot, eyes glazed with tears. She returned a day later carrying a raven feather and speaking in riddles for a full moon cycle. They didn't exile her, they listened. Those who walked the path of the howl did so not for glory or magic. They did it to unmake the tight borders of self. In the village, a man had one name, one role: father, blacksmith, warrior. In the howl, he was only sound, only breath, only part of something, without center. Children were not allowed at first, but some came anyway, hid behind stones, watched, mimicked, and over time were allowed to stand in the outer ring. One boy, no more than 7, joined the circle without being told. He howled on his first breath. No one corrected him. That night a wolf was seen sitting on a ridge above the glade. It did not move. It did not howl. It only watched. That child grew to become one of the most silent hunters the spiral kin ever knew. The howl ritual was not repeated often. Some clans did it once per winter, others only when a wolf died near their land, and always, always when a member passed, especially those who left no body. They believed the howl carried the soul, not upward, but outward, into the woods, into the pack, into the spiral. Not all could bear it. Some tried and broke, their minds filled with too much noise. Their breath couldn't match the rhythm. They wept too early, left too soon. They weren't shunned, only guided elsewhere, because the howl wasn't a requirement. It was a surrender. Later, when villagers spoke of them, they said the spiral hunters had lost their humanity, but they were wrong. The spiral hunters hadn't lost it. They had thinned it, spread it wide, blurred it into the breath of animals and wind and soil. And in that howl half mourn, half communion, they had found something sharper than words, something ancient, something waiting. It sat halfway up the slope of a forgotten ridge just above the tree line, where the wind burned dry and the pines thinned into twisted skeletons. The entrance was nothing remarkable, a narrow crack in the limestone, half choked with snow and shadow. Locals had passed it for generations without curiosity. Hunters avoided it. Birds did not nest nearby. But one year, during a rare thaw, a rock slide exposed more of the opening end. Something else, a scattering of bones just beneath the surface, a reindeer skull, a broken jaw, a spiral carved into stone. A team of archaeologists, pulled by rumor and funded by coincidence, made the climb the following summer. They expected a den, a collapsed burial, something pagan perhaps. What they found, instead, was silence, layered in centuries. The cave extended deeper than expected. Its walls, rough and damp, led into a narrow corridor barely wide enough for a man to pass sideways. The light vanished quickly. So did the sound. Deeper in, the tunnel opened into a chamber. Low ceiling, uneven floor, cold, and everywhere bones. Not scattered, not dumped, arranged. Some human, some wolf, mixed, laid in gentle arcs around the chamber's center, where a shallow fire pit sat choked in ash. No soot marked the ceiling, no signs of ritual burning, no grave goods in the traditional sense, only carved bone tools, a few hide scraps, one broken bow made of antler, its string long rotted away, and at the far wall etched deep into the limestone was a spiral, large, crude, but unmistakable. It wrapped outward from a single claw mark. The bones were old. Radiocarbon dating placed them between 900 and 1100 CU within the Viking Age. But they didn't match expected patterns. No trauma, no signs of violent death, no cremation, no burial markers, just quiet cohabitation. Two sets of remains were particularly strange. One, a mature male wolf, scarred but whole, died of age, teeth worn flat, spine curved slightly from long winters. The body was curled in repose, as if sleeping. The other, a human male, estimated to be in his 30s, lean bones, healed fractures on both legs, traces of arthritis in the knees, and shoulders consistent with prolonged exposure to cold and strain. His fingers were long, joints thickened. Wear patterns on his molars matched a diet heavy in dried meat, root fiber, and raw fat. But what stunned the team most was the positioning. The man and wolf had been placed or had died side by side, their bodies nearly touching, their heads angled slightly toward one another, as if the last moment had been shared. The wolf's ribs showed no gnawing. The human's cloak fragments still preserved in the alkaline soil was stitched with sinew and layered with wolf fur, not hide. Fur, as if skinned with care, not stripped. They had not died alone, and they had not died in fear. Who they were no one knew. No inscriptions, no name stones, no clan symbols or charms. Only the spiral, repeated 3 times around the chamber in claw-carved rings, a symbol found nowhere in Viking graves, but whispered in forest tales. When the findings were made public, scholars debated endlessly. Was this a hermit? A madman? Had the wolf been his pet? Had the cave been a place of exile? But one anthropologist disagreed. She pointed to the lack of hierarchy, the absence of dominance. No blade, no collar, no chain, just proximity. She called it evidence of partnership without domestication, not worship, not ownership, coexistence. The cave became known among researchers as the listening chamber, not for its acoustics, but for what it refused to answer. Every year a few hike up to see it. Most report the same thing. The wind near the entrance falls silent, completely. No echo, no rustling, just stillness, the kind that asks you to listen with your bones, not your ears. Some find tokens left behind modern offerings. Bones tied with sinew, spirals scratched into bark and tucked between stones. A pelt, once, folded neatly at the threshold. One local swears he saw a wolf pass behind the cave, one dawntail high, eyes bright. It stopped, looked directly at him, and walked on. No threat, no panic, just passage, as if acknowledging something that hadn't ended, only changed shape. They left behind no sagas, no chants by the fire, no poems sung at weddings, no verses etched into wood or stone. For a people so deeply woven into the oral tradition of the Norse, the spiral hunters exist only in the negative space conspicuous by absence, not forgotten by chance, but excluded by design. Skalds were the keepers of memory. They chose what to remember and how to shape it. Their verses honored warriors, kings, voyagers. Their words immortalized battles, betrayals, and boasts. But they did not sing of those who walked away. They did not celebrate the ones who refused the sword, who answered the wild instead of the longhouse. Because the spiral hunters were not just strange, they were dangerous, not in the way of axes and fire, but in something deeper, philosophical, spiritual. They undermined the very foundations of Norse order. In Viking society, everything had its placeman, god, beast. Hierarchies were clear. The chieftain ruled, the warrior fought, the thrall served, the gods demanded sacrifice. The sea brought wealth. And wolves? Wolves were hunted, feared, killed. But the spiral hunters reversed this script. They wore no sigils, acknowledged no king, offered no sacrifice to Odin or Thor. They didn't worship the gods of war and wisdom. They aligned themselves with silence, with cycles, with creatures that could not speak but knew more than they showed. To the skalds, they represented erasure, not just of culture, but of purpose. How could you sing a song about a man who refused his name? How could you honor someone who left his family without oath or feud? How do you rhyme a verse with vanishing? The answer was, you didn't. And so they were cut out, omitted from genealogies, omitted from the tales of border raids and bear hunts. When children asked about those who had disappeared, elders changed the subject. Skalds mocked them if press called them cowards, spirits, forest fools. But fear lingered beneath the ridicule, because their absence made people uneasy. They weren't martyrs. They weren't outlaws. They didn't die gloriously. They simply chose differently, and that choice spread like frost, quiet, creeping, hard to reverse once it set in. Whispers grew in villages across the north. That spiral, marks had been found on trees near trails where no one lived. That meat left at the edge of the woods sometimes disappeared without tracks. That a child had dreamt of a woman in fur who spoke in wind patterns and left claw prints in her bed straw. The skalds tried to drown the rumors in louder sagas, tales of berserkers, of sea dragons, of frost giants. They gave the people thunder to cover the silence. But silence doesn't die that easily. One skald, a woman named Arna, broke ranks. She claimed in a private gathering that her brother had left the tribe to join the wild ones and that she had seen him a year later in the trees. He was not thin, not sick. He was strong, calm, watching, with wolves beside him. Her peers denounced her, said she had imagined it, said grief had broken her mind. But her verses changed. She began singing of the Edge Papala nameless tribe that lived in rhythm with snow and claw. She described the spiral as not a shape, but a way of going, not away from society, but deeper than it. Her songs were banned. She was silenced. And yet fragments of her words survive scrawled in the margins of a monk's diary 2 generations later. He'd heard them from a child in a fishing village, who said her grandmother sang them only when the snow fell without wind. They walk between the howl and hush, where breath becomes the path. No throne, no blade, no funeral pyre, just paw prints in the ash. If those verses were true, then the spiral hunters did not reject Norse values entirely. They refined them, honored them in a different form. Bravery was not in dying loudly, but in living quietly. Honor was not in vengeance, but in humility. Glory was not in the hall, but in the stillness of the woods. And that terrified those in power, because if too many followed the spiral, who would raise the walls? Who would raid? Who would sing the names of kings? The spiral hunters didn't want followers, but they inspired them nonetheless. And so the skalds sharpened their words like spears pointed not at their enemies, but at the possibility of silence. They sang louder, longer, filled the longhouses with sound. But outside the door, in the breath between songs, the forest waited, listening, and those who heard it truly heard it did not ask for stories. They followed the spiral instead. In the surviving fragments of this forgotten path, one truth rises like mist from pine. Not all who vanished into the spiral were men. The stories often speak of hunter stoic, fur-clad, trailing wolves. But buried beneath the frost of history lies another truth, quieter, but no less powerful. Women walked into the woods too, and when they did, they didn't follow men. They followed something older. Across the northern coastlines, in villages where the wind carries more memory than name, there are stories of women who left without scandal. No punishment, no banishment. They simply disappeared. A healer who gathered herbs at the edge of the forest and never came back. a weaver who laid down her spindle and walked into a snowstorm barefoot, a girl who stopped speaking after her sister died and was last seen kneeling beside a wolf's den in spring. These women did not leave for husbands, nor for gods. They left for silence. And yet, they were not alone. In Sami and Finno-Ugric oral traditions, there are traces of them: forest mothers, claw sisters, spiral walkers, figures without titles, always female, who lived beyond the map. They taught the names of mushrooms not found near villages. They appeared in dreams before childbirth or storm. They sang not with voice, but with gesture, and when they were seen, which was rare, they were never hurried, never afraid. They moved like weather. One tale from the Tornedalen speaks of a woman named Ilmi who returned from the woods after a full decade. She brought with her no child, no wolf, no tale of capture, only silence, a bundle of wrapped bones, and a tattoo of a spiral on her chest, made from crushed berries and ash. She gave the bones to her village elder, whispered, "For her," and left before nightfall. No one followed. Another story tells of a midwife who delivered her last child under a moonless sky. After the birth, she passed the child to its father, stood slowly, and walked into the tree line. She was never seen again. But the next winter, during a famine, someone left a bundle of dried fish and herbs beside the village gate. No tracks, no footprints, only a carved token made from antler, shaped like a paw with a human thumb. For those who lived in the spiral, gender had no hierarchy. There were no matriarchs, no chieftains, no warriors or wives. There were only those who listened and those who did not. But within this balance, the women brought something particular. They brought continuity. Men often came to the spiral after rupture, after war, grief, exile. But women came before the break. They sensed the wound before it tore. They moved toward the edge not to escape, but to seed. The forest was not empty. It was waiting. And the women who entered it knew how to feed it. They left bits of food in knot holes, wrapped hair in bark, and hung it from branches. They sang lullabies without words to the roots of trees. Some say they birthed children in those woods. No swaddling, no iron charms, no naming rights, only warmth, breath, and the knowledge of wolves nearby. These children would have no clan, no father's ring, but they would learn early how to read paw prints, how to know hunger, how to watch the wind for answers. Skeptics say these are myths, forest witches, cautionary tales, archetypes. But one excavation in southern Lapland uncovered a burial unlike any other from the period. A single female skeleton, adult, placed on her side with arms curled forward. Around her, wolf bones, arranged not scattered, some nested into her ribs, others at her feet. No sign of violence, no grave goods save a carved piece of driftwood pressed into her palm. The carving, a spiral. Anthropologists argued over its meaning. A spiritual figure? A sacrifice? But the evidence defied easy answers. There was no burn layer, no offering pit, no signs of death in conflict. Only co-presence. She and the wolves had died close in time, perhaps even together. The spiral once again, marked not belief but belonging. In the mythic memory of the North, the wolf was never just a beast, it was a mirror. And women, long excluded from the shield wall and the skald's scroll, found in that mirror not fear but reflection. The pack, after all, is not ruled by brawn. It is ruled by rhythm, by presence, by nurture, by discipline. In some spirals etched into cave walls, the figure at the center is not a hunter, not a god, but a woman kneeling, her arms extended. Around her, curved lines, some say claws, others say voices. What did the spiral hunters call her? They didn't. She didn't need a name. The forest knew her. and that was enough. They left behind no alphabet, no rune staves, no saga scrolls, no carved stones to name the dead. The spiral hunters did not believe memory belonged to ink or stone. They believed it belonged to rhythm to pattern, to form, to things the wind could carry and the moss could hide. And so their messages were never spoken. They were marked, found across the northern forests, across the birchwood bones of Scandinavia. The symbols are sparse but recurring, always small, always hidden, always layered in silence. The most common and most mysterious was the spiral claw, a curved mark, rarely more than a hand's length in size. Not a perfect spiral, but irregular like a claw print dragged through ash, curling inward, sometimes etched into bark, other times burned into bone, scratched into antler, or shaped from twigs lashed with gut cord. It was not ornamental. Wherever it appeared, things changed. Hunters reported losing trails near trees marked with the spiral. Dogs refused to pass beneath its curve. One old woman said she found the mark on a stone beside her goat pen 3 days later. The goats refused to leave the shelter, as if sensing something had moved through the ground itself. But the spiral was never a threat. It was a boundary, a threshold, a whisper that said, "This is not yours. Step lightly." The claw form was deliberate. Unlike Viking runes, with their clean angles and vertical lines, the spiral was curved, organic, slow, like breath, like a snare tightening, like the howl before the strike. In one cave, now sealed by time, researchers found a set of marks so subtle they went unnoticed for years. Only after careful torchlight scanning did the pattern emerge. 7 spiral seach with a single etched claw at the center. They circled a flat stone on which lay a carved wolf paw, its toes elongated, almost human. Some believe it was an initiation site. Others say it was a grave. A third theory remains unspoken, that it was not for the living at all. The symbols weren't confined to caves. On bones of elk found deep in uninhabited valleys, spiral claws appear etched near the base of the skull or along the ribs. The cuts are shallow, ritualistic, not from butchery. It's as if the hunters had left a mark to honor the spirit of the prayer, to signal to others that the death had purpose. One artifact, now held in a museum in Uppsala, is a pendant of carved reindeer bone. At first glance, it resembles a tooth, but on closer inspection, it bears the spiral claw etched so finely that only frost reveals its curve. The pendant was found beneath a cairnot, buried, but left. No body, no belongings. Just the pendant, placed under a layer of pine needles and bound in a braid of hair and sinew. Who it was left for, no one knows. But the mark speaks for itself. It wasn't just a symbol of the spiral hunters. It was their language. It spoke of direction, but not destination. It hinted at presence without needing name. It could be read by those who knew the pattern and ignored by those who didn't. It was selective memory only for the ones willing to see. And it wasn't always carved. Some hunters painted it in blood onto stones, just before snowfall, knowing the mark would vanish by morning. Others pressed it into fresh ash with their fingers, or shaped it from water droplets on frozen bark, a symbol designed to disappear but still leave a feeling behind. Children in some villages drew it in the snow without knowing where it came from. One chieftain's son, after a long illness, was said to have traced the spiral claw on his blanket with his finger as he died. He'd never been taught the shape. No one in the village knew it, but someone had known it once. The mark showed up elsewhere, quiet places, borderlands, on the wooden beams of an abandoned longhouse, on the underside of a fishhook carved from whalebone, in the pattern of stones laid around a hearth that no one remembered building. Even in the oral traditions of distant tribes, Sami, Kavan, old forest peoples there are echoes of the shape. They call it different names: the curling tooth, the sleeping hook, the ear of wind, all mean the same thing. It is not a sign of power. It is a sign of listening. It does not demand fear. It asks for respect. The spiral claw marks a place not with conquest, but with caution. And when truly seen, it changes the way one walks, not just through the forest, but through the world. At first, their disappearance was a whisper. The longhouse would grow quiet during counting. A hunter's name wasn't called. A sleeping mat remained unused. A daughter asked where her mother had gone. The replies were always the same. She's out gathering. He's following game. They'll be back with the thaw. But the thaw would come, and the mat stayed empty. The spiral hunters never made announcements. They left behind no declarations, no rites, no oaths. They slipped away with the snowmelt, or during the fog of first frost, and for a time the village let them go. It was easier than asking why. But then the bad winters came, the years when the fish didn't bite, when raiding ships returned with fewer hands and less silver. Crops froze in the soil, children coughed themselves raw through the night, and suddenly silence became unbearable. The woods, once feared, now held promise. It was said that those who had gone feral lived without hunger, without plague. Whispers spread maybe they knew something the rest had forgotten. So the village called, not with drums or horns, but with meat and message. Offerings were left at the tree line. Salted cod, bundles of herbs, bones etched with prayers. They carved spirals into the bark, imitating the marks they once mocked. A skald even rewrote an old verse, twisting it into a plea. Come down, wolf. Brother, howl for us now. Days passed. Nothing came. Then, one morning, the offerings were gone. Not torn, not scattered, gone, and in their place, a single paw print. Not deep, not bloody, just a shallow mark pressed into frost. Too large for a dog, too clean for a prank. The village waited, but no one came. A week later, someone knocked at the gate. She was tall, cloaked in fur. Her face was painted with ash and soot. Around her neck, a necklace of woven pine needles. In her hand, a wrapped bundle meat, roots, medicine herbs. She said nothing. When they asked her name, she looked confused. When they offered her food, she bowed once and placed the bundle at the elder's feet. Then she turned and walked away. The elder called after her. She didn't answer. Later, that elder would describe her not as unfriendly but unhooked, unlatched from the world they lived in, as if she walked not just through space, but through something deeper, a separate current beneath the river of time. After that, others came, never more than one at a time, always quiet, always cloaked. They brought small gifts, smoked meat, carved bone tools, poultices for wounds no one had mentioned aloud. They never asked for thanks. They never stayed, and they never spoke of returning. Some villagers tried to follow them, hunters, mostly curious, respectful, but the woods swallowed them, not with death, but with misdirection. Paths curved in impossible ways. Tracks dissolved. One man followed for 2 days and came back with no memory of the second day. Another never came back at all. Only a wolf was seen, days later, pacing the ridge near the village with something human in its eyes. Still, the need persisted. During a great sickness zone that took 3 elders and half the children, someone left a carved wooden wolf at the base of the old pine where the offerings were once taken. The next day, small bundles appeared outside every sick household. Herbs bound with black thread, a spiral claw painted in bloodroot on the cloth. The children recovered, but no one ever saw who left the bundles. After that, the village stopped calling, not from disappointment but from understanding. The spiral hunters had not rejected them out of hate. They had simply chosen another path, and that path had rules. One of them was this: you cannot bring the old world into the spiral. To enter, you had to shed it. Name, need, noise. If you called, they would not come. But if you listened, sometimes the trees would answer, sometimes the wolves would pause, and sometimes, just sometimes, something would move in the mist and leave behind a mark. Not a word, a spiral, and that would be enough. They were not a tribe in the traditional sense. No banners, no sigils, no ancestry recited by the hearth. If they had lineages, they were kept in breath, not in blood. If they had history, it was buried beneath snow and ash, carved into stone only when wind or claw demanded it. They were the clan of no names. Among the Norse, a name was everything. It anchored you to family, to reputation, to the sagas yet to be written. Names linked fathers to sons, clans to territory, warriors to honor. To be named was to be known, and to be known was to be remembered. It was immortality through voice. But the spiral hunters believed differently. They believed names created distance, that to name something was to separate yourself from it, to claim it, control it, fence it with sound, and what they sought was not dominion but dissolution. So they gave up their names. It didn't happen all at once. Some began by refusing to speak them. Others asked their kin to stop using them. They burned their name runes, buried their carved tokens beneath old roots. One by one, they unthreaded themselves from the stories others had written about them. And in that silence, something shifted. When you are no longer bound by a name, you begin to listen differently. The ego thins. The need to be seen dissolves. You watch without performing. You walk without leaving a trail. They still spoke, when needed, but rarely of self. If they referred to each other, it was through gesture, through role, through presence, a tilt of the head, a shared scar, a certain way of walking. You learn to know someone, not by what they called themselves, but by what they carried in stillness. This was not shame, it was liberation. Even within the spiral path, there were no ranks. No one ruled. Leadership, when it existed, was contextual, shaped by season, by moment. One might lead the hunt in spring and follow during the rites of ice. Another might heal, but never speak. The group moved as water through stone, adapting, adjusting, always listening. They did not wear symbols of self. If they carried totems, they were shared, bone loops worn by many, fur bands passed from hand to hand. Their spiral claw carvings marked not individuals, but places of transformation where something had ended or begun. To outsiders, this was madness. How could people survive without roles, without identity, without hierarchy? But to the clan of no names, the question itself missed the point. They did not seek survival. They sought immersion, not in society. In cycle, some say they practiced rituals to strip the name from the body, days of fasting, fireless nights, whispered chants in the dark. Others say it was simpler. You just stopped answering to your name, and eventually, it left you, like breath, like mist, at sunrise. One account tells of a young boy who returned from a spiral camp after 3 winters. When his mother called his name, he paused, but did not turn. When asked who he was, he said only, "I am where my feet are," and that was enough. Their detachment from name was not rejection. It was a return to something older. The wolves, after all, did not name each other. They knew through scent, through motion, through presence. The wind did not need introduction. The river did not call itself anything but river. In releasing their names, the spiral hunters aligned themselves with the unnamed world. That is why the skalds could never sing of them, why the sagas left them blank. To remember them, you could not recite. You had to feel. And so, those who still walk the old forests speak not of names, but of moments, of a shadow passing through snow at dawn, of a spiral etched in bark that wasn't there the day before, of a bundle of herbs left for a sick child, tied in black hair. These are not stories you tell. They are stories you walk into. And if you ever meet one of the Mon who wears silence like a cloak and watches you not with suspicion, but with stillness, do not ask their name. They will not give it. And if they did, it wouldn't be theirs, because they belong to no one, not even to themselves. They were not many, and they were not expected. Among those who vanished into the forest, most went alone, or in pairs adults who made their choice with full hearts and worn hands. But sometimes something followed them into the spiral that neither they nor the world had prepared for. Children. Some were born within the longhouses, raised on porridge and sagas, but chose the quiet path after watching their kin disappear into the trees. Others were carried into the woods in silence, infants too small to understand, wrapped in fur and breath, pressed to their mothers' chests as they crossed into a life without firelight. But the most mysterious were those born after the crossing, conceived in the snow caves, beneath ash-marked moons, in places where names no longer held meaning. These were the children of the spiral, the wolf-born. Not wolves in body, of course. They were human of flesh and bone, of cry and breath, but they arrived different. The midwives who delivered them, if any were present at all, spoke of their silence. Their eyes, dark and wide, searching, their uncanny calm. They did not scream as others did, and as they grew, they revealed more. They walked earlier, their steps sure, their balance preternatural, their feet padded softly across stone and soil, barefoot in frost without complaint. They did not speak in full sentences until much later, but they listened with deep, unnerving stillness. They watched the faces of others with the intensity of scouts. Animals did not fear them. Wolves, especially. There are stories of pups approaching them without growl, or caution pressing noses against their bellies, curling beside them in sleep. One tale speaks of a child found asleep in a hollow, nestled against two half-grown wolves, breathing in rhythm, and when she was lifted by her father, she didn't cry. She simply looked back one seat, the place she had slept. It wasn't magic. It wasn't madness. It was presence. The wolf-born children were not raised above the forest. They were raised within it. Their games were not swordplay, but silence. Their lessons were not shouted, but shown. They learned the movement of the wind by touch, the rhythm of animals by observation. They learned hunger and stillness, and how to read intent in body tension, not tone. They had no names. They answered to whistles, to gestures, to scent, and when brought near the villages on rare occasions they struggled. The noise, the rules, the pressure to speak and perform, they recoiled from it. One boy refused to wear shoes. Another would not eat bread. A girl, upon hearing a skald recite a saga of war, covered her ears and shook until she was taken back to the tree line. Some saw them as wild, broken, but others saw something else. A chieftain's daughter once disappeared during a snowstorm. Search parties were sent. Days passed. Then one night, she walked back into the village on her own, wearing a fur. Not her own. Her hair bound in sinew, spiral marks drawn on her hands with berry dye. She said nothing of what had happened, only that the boy with yellow eyes showed me the quiet. She never named him, never explained. But after that, she stopped shouting, stopped craving gold or feasts. She slept outside, even in winter, and tied feathers into her braids. She grew up to become a midwife and was known for curing fevers with smoke and stone. The villagers never questioned her again. Among the spiral hunters, the wolf-born were not praised or protected. They were simply allowed to be without pressure, without molding. They chose their own rituals, their own gestures. They painted themselves with patterns only they understood. Some vanished into the woods alone at 7 or 8. returning days later with ash in their hair and fresh claw scars on their legs uninfected, unbothered. Others never returned at all. Were they more than human? Or just untouched by what the world calls normal? No one knows. But when the forest grows quietened, when the howl of wolves seems to bend in unnatural ways, those who still listen say it's them, still out there, running, not wild, not lost, just aligned. And the spiral, if left alone long enough, always bends toward them. They did not return to the world of the village, not truly, but when war Cimmerial war, not raids, not feuds, they were seen again. It began in the borderlands, where rival clans clashed over salt roots and grazing rights. One winter, too many herds vanished, and tempers sharpened like blades. Men gathered beneath banners, steel rang through the woods, and blood darkened the snow. At first, the spiral hunters stayed silent, but war spills like fire. It does not stop where it starts. Soon, flames licked at the edge of old forests. Wolves fled, elk trails were trampled under boot, and with them, the silence that had protected the spiral way for generations was shattered. And so the watchers stepped out of shadow not to fight, but to redirect. They were never seen during the day, never on the field, but their signs appeared. Arrows planted upright in paths pointing away from danger, traps disarmed before soldiers stepped into them, strange symbols painted on trees that made horses refuse to go forward. Some called it sorcery, others knew better. The spiral hunters had become night scouts, whispered shadows that slipped through camps and passed patrols like fog. They spoke to no one, left no demands, but they altered the course of war. One night, a war band from the southern fjords advanced toward a rival village. They camped beside a frozen stream. By morning, half their sleds were gone stolen, but relocated miles upriver. Their firewood had been replaced with wet bark, and the trees around their camp bore spiral claw marks, 3 of them, arranged in a triangle. They turned back. Another story tells of a warrior chieftain who awoke to find his war paint erased from his face, cleaned with cold water, and reapplied in the pattern of a wolf's muzzle. His beard was braided with bone, his sword polished and laid across his chest. A warning. He fled the valley before the next dawn. No blood had been spilled, but a message had been carved into the rhythm of his sleep. Those who remained behind began to whisper about the windwalkers' figures seen on ridges under moonlight, wrapped in fur, eyes reflecting like coals. Wolves followed them, or led them. No one was sure. They never engaged directly. No spiral hunter was ever captured. No camp was ever found. But the stories spread, and fear grew not. The fear of a berserker, loud and frothing, but of something colder, smarter, watching. The spiral was not there to take sides. It was there to restore balance, to push the fire back before it burned everything. A few soldiers claimed they were helped. A scout lost in a snowstorm said he was led back to camp by a figure who made no sound, but whose hand was warm despite the cold. When he tried to speak, the figure vanished. In his pocket he found a bone-carving spiral marked, smooth from years of touch. In some battles, arrows missed their mark by inches if nudged by breath. Fires died suddenly. Swords cracked along their spines. It was never enough to prove anything, but enough to make men hesitate. And hesitation, in war, is power. The skalds began to murmur about the forest oath-breakers, those who had turned their backs on society and now haunted its edges. But even their songs held a tinge of reverence, because deep down, everyone knew. There was no anger in the spiral's actions, only response. One elder, interviewed decades later, said it best: "They do not fight like us, they do not kill like us. They remove the reason for killing. That's more frightening than any axe. Eventually, peace came through treaty, but exhaustion. The war burned itself out. The woods were left scorched in places. But the spiral endured, and as quietly as they had appeared, the night scouts vanished. No one saw them leave. But for a time after, the wolves lingered closer to villages, silent, watching, as if reminding the people of something they'd forgotten, something older than war, something that moves only when moved against, something that walks without sound and leaves no tracks behind. In Norse society, the vulva stood apart. She was not a priestess, nor a warrior, nor a wife. She was something older even than Odin's runes, a walker between worlds, a speaker of dreams, a weaver of fate's raw thread. People feared her not because she ruled, but because she saw. The vulva carried her staff long, often curved like a serpent's spine end with it. She walked into trance, into smoke, into time. She lived near the edge of the village, but her power reached through it like roots beneath soil. When crops failed or children sickened, it was to her that people turned, she who murmured into bones and stones and fire. But what happens when a vulva leaves not just her hut but the world itself? There were a few never named who did just that. Volur, who saw past the village's need, who looked beyond the gods' demands, who stepped into the forest and did not return, not out of madness, not from shame, but from calling. These were the ulffolk lineage never written down, known only in fragments and footprints. In certain woods, there are whispers of women with painted faces who sit beside wolves in silence. They do not chant. They do not beg the gods for answers. They listen. They place their palms on the earth and let it speak. They walk with claws braided into their hair. They fast with the pack. And in dreams they become more than human, part scent, part soil, part soundless rhythm. They do not practice magic in the way the villagers understood it. No spells, no runes etched in blood. Instead, they practiced alignment, the deep, invisible tether between being and place. To them, the wolf was not a symbol. It was a sibling, not tamed, not worshipped, mirrored. The wolf teaches without word. It shows how to endure without praise, how to kill without cruelty, how to wait without wasting. The vulva who walked the spiral learned these lessons not from books, but from breath. One tale survives in Sami oral tradition of a woman who wore no shoes and left no prints. She was seen only in winter, near a frozen lake, her cloak stitched with bones and fur from a single pack. When a child went missing, she was the one who returned him. The boy could not speak for weeks. When he finally did, he said only, "She listens with her whole body." Another story tells of a vulva who was invited to bless a harvest. Instead, she buried her staff in the ground and walked away. That winter, when rot consumed the grain, people remembered her silence. They found the staff months later, its wood twisted with new growth, sprouting a single pine sapling. Scholars often try to separate myth from truth, but the wolf vulva resists both. She cannot be dissected. Her rituals leave no trace. Her speech is not meant for parchment. It lives only in the spaces between things. The bond between wolf and vulva was not mystical in the sense of fantasy. It was functional, a merging of discipline and instinct, of prophecy and presence. The vulva learned from the wolves how to shape paths through scent, how to hold space through posture, how to touch the edges of death without flinching. In turn, she offered them something rare, trust without condition. Wolves do not worship, but they remember. Some spiral markings bear delicate claw impressions around a central stone like a shrine made not by human hands but by paws. Bones arranged in circles, fur bundles placed atop cold cairns. They are not for gods. They are for memory. And in that memory, the vulva walks still. In some dreams she returns, a figure in fur, her face masked in soot, her breath clouding the air in slow pulses. She does not speak, but those who wake from such dreams often find they've walked farther than they realized, miles through forest, barefoot, without fear. One woman, upon waking, found a paw print on her doorstep. Inside it, a single sprig of yarrow. The wolf velva was not a title, it was a state, a merging, a surrender to something ancient. And when she finally passed, if she did, there were no funeral rites, no weeping, only stillness. The pack would know, the forest would remember, and the spiral would deepen, as it always did. Because when spirit meets silence, something beyond story takes shape, and it cannot be named, only followed. There was no battle, no final stand, no climactic tragedy to close the chapter. The spiral hunters didn't vanish in flame or glory. They faded like breath in frost. For generations, their presence lingered along the edges of mapped land, in strange footprints, in spirals carved too high for human reach, in stories that grandparents told not to frighten, but to warn gently. Not all paths return. Into Few Sis. Chapter 4. End of Sis. For note, but sometime after the 12th century, the stories slowed. Villagers stopped hearing wolves near the tree line. Marks once found in the bark went unnoticed. Children no longer dreamed of yellow eyes in the dark. There were no offerings left at the edge of fields. No meat bundles vanished in the night. The silence that spiral hunters once moved through had swallowed even them. Their trail, once barely visible even to those who watched for it, finally disappeared. But why? Some say it was the coming of new faith. As Christianity spread through the north, many old ways were buried beneath crosses and candles. Wolves were cast as devils in fur. Silence was no longer sacred, but suspect. Forests were cleared, rivers were renamed, and the spiral, once whispered between generations, became a thing to fear or forget. Others blamed the slow death of the forest itself. The hunger for timber grew. Ships needed masts. Towns needed beams. The deep woods, once unbroken and alive with presence, became corridors of stumps and mud. The wolves withdrew. The prey scattered. And with them, those who had once walked without names had nowhere left to vanish into. But some say they chose to leave, that they felt the change coming, heard it in the bird song, read it in the shifting elk migrations, that they sensed the balance tilting, the spiral tightening to a point too sharp to survive. And so they gathered, not to fight, but to listen one final time. There is an old story spoken only in northern dialects of a final gathering in a hidden valley, snow falling without sound. Dozens gathered, men, women, children, all cloaked in furs grayed with age, their faces painted in ash, bone, or nothing at all. No words were spoken, only one final howl, not to summon, not to warn, to release. One long breath, shared between them and the wolves at their sides. A goodbye not to each other, but to this world, to the trees they had known, to the sky that once turned above them like a drum, to the trails they could no longer walk. When the snow melted that spring, the valley was empty. Not a mark remained. No bones, no fur, no spiral etched into the stones. Only one thing was found by a shepherd, years later. At the center of the clearing, buried beneath a thin layer of soil, lay a single carved tooth. Wolf, etched not with runes, but with a shallow spiral barely visible in light, impossible in shadow. He took it home, but his dog wouldn't stop barking. He buried it again the next day. Since then, spiral marks have become rarer, scattered, fragmented, found only in places so remote that even modern maps struggle to name them, always near water, always in silence. And when a real wolf howls in those places, when its voice splits the night like memory, some swear they hear a second tone layered behind it. Not echo, not animal, something else, something human, something remembering. They left no scrolls, no runestones, no traceable language carved in the usual bones of history. And yet, they may not have vanished completely. In the last few decades, deep in the tundra-bound corners of northern Scandinavia, something began to emerge, not in myths or murmurs, but in blood. Scientists, collecting DNA samples for unrelated population studies, began to notice irregularities, not errors, not mutations, just differences, lineages that didn't quite fit the established migration models, mitochondrial lines that seemed older than expected, or that branched in ways no one could easily explain. Some of these genetic patterns surfaced in isolated villages near the borders of Lapland and Norway, places surrounded by wetlands and dense birch forests. Others emerged in coastal communities that had once been tied to the inland wilderness through reindeer migration routes. In many of these places, the elders still speak in low tones about people who walked away, about a silence in the bones that runs deeper than kinship. They claim to descend from no one, or from someone whose name was buried generations ago. Their features vary: blonde, dark, tall, short, but many share unusual traits. A heightened sense of smell, night vision slightly sharper than average, a resistance to cold that seems out of place in modern physiology. Anthropologists once dismissed these anecdotes, but the DNA does not lie. In some families, a certain cluster of gene markers appears that is more closely related to ancient Siberian wolf populations than expected, not in the same way as a domesticated dog lineage, but as something older, murkier, a proximity in time and space that doesn't match known settlements. One theory proposes an ancient intermingling of human and wolf environments so complete, so intimate, that environmental pressures shaped both species in parallel, producing not hybrids, but reflections. This theory was laughed at until the spiral markers were found. In a cave unearthed in 2017 near the Kittilä region of Finnish Lapland, archaeologists uncovered a shallow chamber filled with stacked stones, spiral etchings, and tools made of antler and shale. Among the remains were fragments of human bone and wolf skulls, arranged side by side. The DNA taken from the bones showed minimal contamination, radiocarbon dated to the early 1100s. The human remains contained a mitochondrial haplogroup, so rare it had previously only been identified in the Siberian highlands. But what shocked researchers wasn't just the DNA, it was the environment. No signs of domestication, no fortification, no burial ceremony, just cohabitation: wolf and human sharing a space as equals. No evidence of domesticated dogs, no signs of violence. The conclusion? These people did not live near wolves. They lived with them. Geneticists are cautious. They call it prolonged cohabitative adaptation, a sterile phrase for something far more intimate. But locals, those whose ancestors still walk frozen ridgelines and mark the snow with unshod feet, have a simpler explanation. They weren't trying to become wolves, one elder said. They were trying to remember what we were before we forgot. In 2020, a university in Tromsø funded a small cultural survey of isolated communities in the region. Participants were asked about family stories, old songs, ancestral names. Dozens of respondents shared drawing spirals scratched on birch bark or driftwood, passed down through generations. They spoke of the quiet people, of those who walk where the claw curves inward. One woman, in her 70s, lifted her shirt to reveal a faded spiral tattoo on her chest. She said it had been given to her by her grandmother. She did not know what it meant, only that she'd dreamed of wolves every winter since. Perhaps the spiral hunters never truly disappeared. Perhaps they moved into places our eyes forgot how to see, into the curl of DNA, into the tremble of instincts we no longer trust, into the breath behind the howl. Modern science may never find their names, but it is beginning to find their shadow, not in story, in blood. In every age, There are those who walk the main road. They build the halls, swing the hammers, raise the stones. They marry, trade, fight, end, are remembered for it. Their names are carved into sagas, their deeds echoed by skalds, their bloodlines mapped like rivers. But there is another kind of person, one harder to see, harder still to follow. These are the ones who step off the road not with rebellion, but with quiet purpose, who leave behind name and fame, not from failure, but from knowing there is another way, a deeper way. The spiral hunters were not saints, they were not prophets, they were not even a people, in the strictest sense. They were a movement slow, deliberate, instinctual, a shift back toward something most had forgotten. They lived not in defiance, but in unbinding, letting go of systems that praised domination and hierarchy, rejecting the notion that power comes from ownership, choosing instead to move in rhythm with the land, with the animal, with the breath, between all things. They asked a question most feared to speak aloud. What if the world remembers better than we do? And they listened for the answer. In the spiral, they found it not a solution, but a direction, a curve that never ended, always folding back on itself, always returning. It taught them how to live with intention, how to hunt without conquest, how to see the wolf not as threat, but as mirror. They did not seek to leave a legacy, but they left one nonetheless. It can be found in the way silence wraps around certain trees, in the markings that appear, carved into antler, long after the carver is gone, in the wolf that lingers a little too long outside the firelight, not stalking but remembering. It lives in the stories passed between grandmothers and restless children, the ones that start with, "There were those who left," and end with, "And sometimes they return, but only in silence." It breathes in the choice to walk barefoot through snow, to leave offerings with no expectation, to fast not for gods, but for clarity. And perhaps, above all, it lives in the question each of us carries, however, faint about what might happen if we stop trying to rule the world and instead began to walk with it again. The spiral never asks for certainty. It only asks for motion, a motion that leads not outward but inward, back to something we once were, back to the place between name and need, between silence and sound, where a wolf's eyes meet our own and neither blinks.